Well, Zietler, this was the right cue for me. This is what we start with.
Was Sie hier sehen, ist der einschlägige.
What you see here is the
Thema Erkenntnis der Natur.
an article about the knowledge about nature. On the lexicon, we have to say that Zietler is so valuable because for the research in the modern period, because the claim was that the knowledge of all the time of his time was to be transferred into these dictionaries or encyclopedias, so that everyone who investigates the first half of the 18th century should take a look at that. Also, his writings are fully digitized today, and the Bavarian State Library hosts his works. So this is the first step. If one wants to gain knowledge about the generally taught knowledge of the early 18th century. Zietler was also the very first modern lexicon or encyclopedia. Modern lexicons like Brockhaus or Meyersches Konversationslexikon, like these, Zietler appeared and was published under the name of the editor. That is, the individual articles don't actually disclose who authored them. The authors were anonymous. Of the few we know about today, we know that this was the scholarly, poor population around the universities of Leipzig. So basically the scientific staff who just had their masters, they authored the articles in the Zietler, to make a living. So here we are seeing ideas of nature the scholarly world reached agreement on in the early 18th century. It's also important to see that what I picked here is an article titled Knowledge About Nature. The term of nature is actually appearing in many different composites in the Zietler lexicon. One of the longest articles deals with nature law, for example, which was, of course, of key importance for the 18th century. So let's now take a look at the article. Knowledge about nature is knowledge that introduces us to God's creatures in the world. It takes the form of common or scholarly knowledge. Common knowledge is certain and introduces us to things we perceive with the senses. This type of knowledge can in turn be divided into two categories, namely natural and artificial knowledge. Natural knowledge is based exclusively on the senses given to us by nature. In the case of artificial knowledge, however, nature is joined by art, and all sorts of instruments are used to augment the senses. We see the smallest objects through lenses made for this purpose and observe the most distant stars close up. We study the properties of air with air pumps and carry out experiments with many similar devices. Scholarly knowledge about nature focuses on the fundamental causes of natural phenomena and is based on probability. This is the type of knowledge that physicians should use the most, but they rely instead mainly on sensory knowledge. So, this was the article. And basically, what we see here is a modern view of science as we would still share it these days. Plus, indeed, what was characteristic for the 18th century, namely the heritage from earlier epochs. This basically overlaps in the 18th century, like this was the case for the whole early modern period. What is very important is we still have the biblical reference here. So God gave humans creation to investigate. So besides the Holy Scriptures, also the creation itself is mentioned here. At the same time, God gave humans enough reason to get knowledgeable with the help of telescopes and all kinds of technical aids. It was possible to find out about nature and the way it was built. So this is a point to the probability. The difference used in the article between natural and artificial was in this case not to be understood as an opposing principle, but it was used in the sense of ars, meaning art, skill, or dexterity. So it was about the expansion of the sensory findings or impressions by technical means as a supplementary means. And natural knowledge draws on the human senses, while artificial knowledge additionally required the work of the mind and hands. So this is what was meant here, namely an expansion of that term. The development of the modern sciences since the 17th century were particularly reflected in the establishment of experimental standards, which were indeed also demanded a lot in the Zedler lexicon. So this was very clear. Since the 17th century, these were or became successfully established, namely how experiments have to be run in controlled environments. And this is indeed demanded in these articles, but also connected to current criticisms, because the anonymous author of this article here, of course, propagates the necessity of a science-oriented medicine. Because he said the physicians, this of course relates to the doctors who had studied medicine in the 18th century, and the author here demands that they should please also let themselves be guided by scientific principles. And according to the opinion of the author, they were still sticking too much to their sensory impressions. Basically, these anecdotal observations were generalized by them in a way that was not correct. So it's a contemporary criticism of the doctors of the time, which was included in the last sentence. And this indeed shows that the various branches of natural science, as we know them today, have modernized in different ways. So there were certain fields of the realization of natural phenomena which were more scientific at the time than others. The insights of that time were also popularized and were also published. What I found and want to show you here is Eberhard Werner Happel. There were also some more beside him, but Werner Happel published his messages about very strange things in all kinds of matters. This was published in 1680 as a magazine, and that was later published in 5 volumes of books. And he's of interest because he was one of the early publishers of the 17th century who really were able to exist and make a living out of their journalistic works rather than having to be employed as a civil clerk or writer. So Happel was one of the early journalists and publishers who were really making a living out of that. So it's therefore very interesting that, among other things, he thinks this also with the latest discoveries in the world, both in the scientific field and also in the field of natural sciences, That is what was discovered in on the new continents. So that money can be made on that. This was the key thing. At the same time, his work also contained the complete mythical stuff we know in terms of all kinds of fairy figures, mythical figures. This is also found in his papers, but also the popularization of current experiments from astrology, etc. So this magazine of the time is also a wild mix of these things. Also, the sensational stories and histories are here being combined with the latest findings of natural sciences. So, how broad was the impact of these publications in reality? And to what extent were the latest findings we know from science history today characteristic for the beliefs of larger groups of populations? Exactly this is very difficult to assess. We just don't know. So even widespread publications of the 17th century are really not bestsellers in the sense we perceive it today. That is, certainly not everyone could afford to read these magazines who was literate. This basically just has, or this is basically just for the target group of a small literate elite who read that. And to what extent this became widespread and became part of the general awareness of the world and left its traces there is one of the biggest issues in research we encounter. So because it's quite clear that in the libraries you, of course, find the knowledge of the scholars of the time. Here we have to state that the status of natural science, neither in the 18th and particularly not in the 17th century, had become established. The specialization of the various disciplines, what we call biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy today, was only in its infancy at the time. A clear segregation between professional scientists and amateurs was also something that was not yet in place, simply because natural sciences were not institutionalized in the modern sense of the word, only start to become that. Natural science was frequently done in a way where people were sitting together. People were researching, collecting, experimenting together. There were also exchanges in writing, letter writing. There were also reading societies, and especially in the context of the courts, astronomic discoveries, chemistry experiments, and insights were also shown to the public and also popularized this way. Equally, this also took place in the bourgeois culture, up to shows in markets. The status of electricity, for example, in the 18th century was reflected in the fact that people were enthused to show experiments there with static charging, etc. This was taking place at courts, but we also find that in the form of shows in popular markets. So the public became aware of that, and we also have to say that in the 18th century, the electricity that had only just been discovered was tried out for all kinds of things, namely whether it might not be used for therapeutic purposes, for whatever illness, for example. And this is a phenomenon too. We have to say that at fun fairs also very different things were presented and shown and demonstrated, which also served very other forms of interest. So the current technical knowledge did not have a unique selling proposition, so to say, but competed with more traditional ideas and concepts. And also had to get its way in the first place and find acceptance. So it came to the public as a curiosity, first of all. The popularizers also included priests during the Enlightenment, and even from the pulpit they described the advantages of growing potatoes under certain cyclical schemes of using the acreage. So these two were part of the community, and this also made it difficult to assess on what scale knowledge actually became spread beyond the actual discoveries. So all knowledge also has to first become known and become established, of course. Who was interested could definitely also get access to current knowledge productions. The thresholds for access were low from today's perspective because sciences were still in their infancy, differently from today, when, of course, a certain a scientific idiom has become established. But irrespective of that, the new findings had to first become integrated with the existing knowledge body, and antique or canonized knowledge could therefore also contribute to misinformation or fiction becoming authorized, while on the other hand, totally new findings might be counterintuitive and therefore did not really fit into the knowledge stocks. And they might therefore look untrustworthy. This is quite well recognizable when we take a look at the continued prevalence of alchemistic ideas in the 18th century. And a phenomenon we found was that even people well educated in their field and also acting in an enlightening way, like doctors, that they nevertheless adhered to alchemist ideas. A very well-known example here is Kortum, who in Bochum has became very well known as a Renaissance representative, and he also published papers against modern chemists who in turn found on specialized and well-founded knowledge were scolding against the alchemists. But Kortum actually adhered to that simply because alchemy is very closely dovetailed with edifying theological ideas, meditation, and it just had the greater force of conviction. It was more compelling for people. And solely against this background was it that it remained alive. Also, this literature was re-edited time and again. So in the 18th century, it was still very normally available in bookshops, this literature. And here we see another problem. Modern chemistry, that is, the insights we find in the papers on the history of natural scientists, these were specialists who were very well versed in this matter, but it was not the general knowledge. And this is why we can also state that at this point the gap was opening.
Ja, kan det være for en egen anden skibberige, eller tager med rejst i
What was quite spectacular in this context was that enlightened authorities recommended the installation of lightning rods and on churches, and especially on pilgrimage churches. And these still and they also banned magical religious practices such as the so-called Wetterläuten, that is the ringing of bells to ward off storms and protect against lightning and hail. So the local communities adhered to this church service. They wanted it to continue. Rebecca Habermas also investigated that in her doctoral thesis on using the example of pilgrimage. And she found that the enlightened priest also could not resist the congregation who wanted that ringing of bells. But he might have pointed out that there are lightning rods, but he still has to provide that service. And in the end, the congregation actually wanted the priest to step down because he was so stubborn. So this distinction about reason and superstition was not always as easy as in these cases. In the end of the day, this stubbornness of everyday perception also had it that things we today would regard as a scientific error, now in the René Descartes' teachings, according to which animals were just artful machines. And this idea probably was not very widespread at the time, apart from academic circles, because this was indeed completely contrary to day-to-day practice. Often this became the subject of satire at that time, already in the 17th century. So we see that there is also a kind of blockade against very extreme scientific assumptions. In other examples, superstitious practice sometimes we were also just built on outdated scientific positions or simple misunderstandings. So there is a lot of interaction between different factors here. What we can also state is, and this is also shown by the respective articles of Ziegler, that scientific knowledge of nature had lost its magic since the 16th century. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, the scholarly followers of Magia Naturalis assumed complex and partly hidden relationships within nature, which explicitly included the existence of nature spirits and spirits of the dead. So there were not just angels and demons, but quite a range of other powers there. So the rigorous condemnation of all theology as the work of demons was never the consensus in Europe. Definitely not in the Middle Ages, and also not in the early modern period. However, what can be said is that the naturalists, basically from the 16th century on, abandoned the search for magical similarities between objects and hidden signs in favor of a sympathetic and antipathetic thinking. And they basically started a search for the laws of nature. This is very important. As a result, however, in the 16th century, they also paved the way to the belief in demons, which, in the end of the day, separated the supernatural from the natural, and the supernatural was brought into the realm of the acts of God and the devil, while the natural was increasingly assigned to the laws of nature, which followed a more mathematical order. So, in the end of the day, God was imagined as a kind of engineer who established the laws of nature in a perfect way, and as a result, bound himself to firm rules. And these rules could in turn be investigated and recognized by humans, starting from astronomy and physics. That is, these were the disciplines which played a pioneering role. So starting with these, nature was successively mathematized and regulated, while the ideas of sympathy and antipathy are largely predicated on associative observations, namely partly the dovetailing of the different texts. At the latest, since the beginning of the 17th century, the predisposition for errors of these assessments were recognized, and one tried to remedy this by the recognition of generally valid laws of the nature. The assessment that magic was not part of the natural world was therefore initially shared by the natural scientists with the demonologists. We shouldn't overlook that, or precisely because they did not deal with the supernatural. So, in parallel with the development of natural sciences, we can definitely also recognize that we are here also dealing with people recognizing the belief in witches in the second half of the 16th century. And it was to them that the field of the supernatural was left. Before, with the elaboration of the laws of nature, this field was then limited very drastically in the 18th century. And what we also observed was that exactly in the 16th century, the everyday practices of so-called folk magic also came to be regarded as witchcraft in the course of the 16th century and were also criminalized. There was another thing I wanted to mention a while ago. This is typically what Hubble published. This is an example here. And on this slide, we see a table of most various climate zones and the details on the parallelity of certain cities worldwide, namely according to what Hubble knew at that time. So this is typically an example of the knowledge he popularized at the time. And the various cities and his own city too can be assigned to the climate zones. One can take a look at what is still in parallel with each other. So this is the way he, designed knowledge and constituted it. Here, we see a visualization of the various circles in nature, quite well known. Is this representation? You may have seen it a few times already. As to the question how humans had to be localized in nature themselves, on that, there were different traditions in thinking since antiquity, which still had after effects way into the 18th century. Basically, up until today, they still have these after effects. So thinking traditions which worked from the kinship of everything alive as a basic assumption. And what was visualized here in this representation of flood, a new Platonic writing. And what you see very nicely here is at the top this cloud, which basically represents the creator, God, leading nature on a leash, if you like. And on this basis,
I also expect
the nature and its different realms start from that as the basis. We see the three kingdoms of nature here, the minerals, the plants, and the animals in a chain of life. On the outer circle, we also see the universe. So we also have a microcosm-macrocosm representation here. And according to it, at the micro level, the whole cosmos is represented, that is, in the microcosmos level of the humans. And this was also the starting point why astrological constellations were also used as a basis for conclusions relevant for humans, because everything seemed to be connected with everything in this allegoric, systematic way of representing this. Also, several transitions are being shown here. At the same time, humans were generally seen as the rulers of nature. Namely, not just in the Bible, but also Aristotle did that. As a natural philosopher, he enjoyed a high reputation in the Middle Ages, and this was, in fact, incorporated in philosophy. Okay, that was the conclusion. Thanks a lot.